Hi, thanks everyone for joining. We're Rosie and Hollie at the top. I don't know how it's laid out on your screen. And this is our first live event. We're really excited. We've partnered with Scribner Books and the Strand bookstore to host this discussion with Mary Beth Keane. We actually read Ask Again, Yes, her latest novel back in December as part of our Off the Rails book club. So we're really excited to talk about it. And it just came out this week in paperback. I have my copy here. And you can buy it at the Strand. So if you haven't yet read it, you can get it at the Strand. I think we'll put a link in the chat somewhere. And yeah, so we're going to do about a 15-20 minute discussion with Mary Beth, kicking off the conversation with our questions. And then please add your questions to either the chat or the Q&A, and we'll start to answer your questions at the end. We'll give you about 5 or 10 minutes to go through those.
Cool. Sounds good.
So Mary Beth, before we kind of go into the discussion, I'm just going to do a little bit of an intro. Obviously, everyone here kind of has an idea about your book because they've either saw it on Instagram or read it and are excited for this discussion. But a little bit of background on Mary Beth. She attended Barnard College and the University of Virginia, where she received her MFA. She was awarded the John Guggenheim Fellowship for Fiction Writing and has received citation from the National Book Foundation, PEN America, and Hemingway Society. She's the author of The Walking People, Fever, and obviously most recently, Ask Again, Yes, which is an instant New York Times bestseller and has been sold in 21 languages. That's quite impressive. Super exciting milestones for you there.
Yeah, it's been a crazy year, but it's all good. Thanks for having me.
Awesome. So I guess, first thing we wanted to really ask about is like, what was the inspiration behind the book?
God, it's actually a hard question to answer because I think like a lot of authors, I don't quite know why some things rise to the top above others, but I know that I was working on another book. So I wrote Fever, which is historical, and I had this idea for a new historical novel. But then in my real life, I don't know, I turned 40 and I was suddenly finding myself having to deal with all of these things in my real life, like some of the themes in the book, issues to do with, mental illness, addiction, family estrangement, parent, generational differences in relationships. And I think because I'm a writer, I start writing my way through things in order to sort of figure out what I think about them. And then I think I started sort of, to really get some objectivity, I guess, I started thinking of characters. And I really had a lot of pages before I realized that maybe it could be a novel. But it really was sort of, this is in no way, really autobiographical, but it's certainly the themes were lifted from my own life. So that was really the inspiration behind it.
And so I guess that kind of leads me to my next question, characters. I've kind of read a lot about you and heard a lot about your stories, and you always say you kind of start with the characters. How did you get to these characters in your head?
I think, well, there are a couple of different ways to answer. The police officer aspect of things, I think that it was an occupation I was always interested in. And so I just knew that Francis, upon meeting him, was a New York City cop, but a reluctant one is how I saw him. I think I have a lot of police officers in my life, none in my family, and all of them sort of, not all of them, but a lot of them sort of stumbled into the job, and that's how I saw Francis. And I think I was just interested in exploring that, especially since the job itself can be so fraught, right now in particular. Peter, I saw personality traits. I saw the estrangement in his family. I saw how much he was hurting, but I knew that he was a good boy. And for some reason, that was more interesting to me than a kid who sort of lashes out, becomes like, wild child, has no supervision. He could have very well become a kid who was roaming the streets at night, getting up to no good. But to me, it was more heartbreaking to have him be a good boy and do the things that he should be doing. Of course, all of that built up in him. He had to let it was following him nonetheless, however well he behaved. But I don't know. I just saw him as he was mostly. And I can't really explain how. I'm trying, but not very well.
Yeah, it's interesting to understand like how you get into the heads of characters and then make those choices for them, you know, whether it's them making the right or wrong choice or being the good son, or, you know, I'd love to hear how, you know, are there points where they could go two ways and you're like, oh, he'd probably decide to do this or that.
Yeah, I think that this is, you know, I've heard other writers say like, oh, the characters just went off on their own and they do these things that to surprise you. And I really am not a believer in that. But there is something that happens where the character starts determining the plot. You know, like they start doing things that surprise themselves. I'm not afraid of plot. I think 25 years ago, I sort of looked down on plot like a lot of undergraduates, and it was all about the writing. And I still do think that prose is the most important thing. But I do think that putting them in action is what brings out the parts of them that can be really surprising to me and to them.
Mm-hmm.
Oftentimes at readings, I encounter people who say like, well, I would never do such and such a thing. If I were in that room, this is what I would have done. And the whole point for me of writing fiction is to say that none of us, we really don't know what we would do in any situation, and we may surprise ourselves.
Yeah.
Can we talk about Kate for a second?
Sure.
I think she's one of the most mature characters I've read about in a while. Like the entire behavior of how she dealt with Peter's mom, bringing her into the family despite everything that's happened historically, and her. We're just going to say here there's spoilers in this discussion, so if anyone is wary of that. But like Peter's mom shooting her dad, and all the drama that kind of stemmed from that. Yet she still brought her into the family years later, using her to help Peter, allowing her to meet the kids. I honestly think like when I think about that book, that story arc is the one that sticks with me the most.
I mean, that was something that I didn't necessarily see coming until it became, you know, the story sort of started closing in on itself. I knew that Anne would not just disappear, you know, she wouldn't just leave the separate life. And I knew that Kate was really struggling. And I think she really was at her end with what to do. And who do you ask for help from? Your sisters who might, you know, she has two sisters, for those who haven't read, your parents who were kind of all against the match to begin with. You know, so I felt like she had no choice, or that she felt she had no choice than to ask the only person in the world who loved Peter as much as she did for help. And I don't think it came to her easily.
No.
I mean, keeping in mind that she saw Anne more than Peter did over those years, and really didn't reach out until she was absolutely at her wit's end. And then she used whatever she could, and she saw Anne as a way to kind of get to him.
There's a question here from some of the attendees, from Aditi Agrawal. I hope I pronounced this right. Who was your favorite character in the book?
George, easily George. He's not one of them. I guess he's a main character, but he's not one of the, you know, stars. And he, from the moment I wrote his first line, you know, I ended up revising a lot and sort of including him earlier. I just liked him. I saw him. I saw the way he dressed, his like sort of portly build, his accent. I imagine this really thick Queen's accent. And, but he was just like goodness. He was really flawed, but a lot of his demons were sort of settled by the time he came into Peter's life in an important way. But he really didn't know what he was doing. And I think as a juxtaposition of brothers, you know, he rose to the occasion, even though he was guessing a lot of the time. And I think, you know, there's just something basic about like love and life. I don't know what I'm doing. Am I supposed to change the answering machine? And then he, you know, that's a reference to something for those of you who haven't read. But then when he realized, he was able to think the whole thing out, you know. And I think I'm really always interested in a character who's maybe not necessarily that articulate about how he feels, or you know, what's going on in life, and he can't give Peter maybe, you know, a one-on-one the way that another person might, maybe a better educated person, a better, you know, well-read person, but he loved Peter, and that ended up really being enough, I think.
I love George too. He had such a good heart.
Yeah, he did.
And I think I can relate to what you just said. Like sometimes I feel like the way you love sometimes is more action based. Like doing those little things versus like the big emotional embrace, like just changing the answering machine recording is like an act of love, an act of like, I'm embracing you, I'm saving you, I'm taking you in.
Or even like I thought about the moment when Peter, says, I need to borrow your truck, and it's for this girl, Kate. And he's like, what? Like this girl above all the others?
Yeah.
So he like says what he thinks, but he's still not going to, it's not, his love for Peter is not dependent on anything. He told him, I don't agree with this. I don't think this is a good idea, but yeah, like hop in the truck. Obviously, I'm still going to help you. And that just seems to me to be a thing that it sounds so easy, but most of us don't do. We would have stood there and argued, and maybe to show we were against something, we would have taken a stand or held back help. He would help Peter no matter what, even if he thinks, what he's doing is not the greatest idea.
Is it probably like that fine line of like, I know I'm not your dad, so I can't like dad you and force you into things. I'm your uncle, I'm gonna support you, even if I'm not happy about it. I'm just gonna be there for you.
I think there's part of that. He's also really not that much older than Peter, really. It's that weird time in life when if you're 12 and someone's 22, it seems like you're a different generation. But, when you're 42 and someone's 52, it really isn't. I forget the age difference between them exactly, but he's 10 years younger than Peter's father, who was quite young when he had Peter. And so I remember doing the calculation when Peter was in college and George's girlfriend calls Peter to say there's a birthday celebration. And then I added up how old George was, and he was still in his 30s. It was crazy.
Yeah.
So this is a question actually I always think of when reading books like that, or even series and stuff. Do you have like a profile for each character that
No,
you have saved?
I have nothing. I really don't. Oh, sorry, I cut you off.
Oh, sorry. I was just saying like something like date of birth, age, preferences, colors, stuff like that, so that you can always refer to that.
Ages I did just because, this covered so much time and we went back and forth. I went back and forth with the timeline so much, even within a section, I might have a flashback, or something. So I really don't worry about that truthfully in the first two drafts, as long as it's ballpark. But then once I had to reference, or I felt I should reference like current events, like if there was a big game or something, I had to kind of calculate back. Are we in the right year? Was that game, was that no hitter, in fact, 2 years later than this? And that stuff is annoying. But all the other stuff, I mean, I eventually know all that stuff about them, but I don't know what is going to happen, I guess. I don't know anything about the plot before I begin, or really until I have at least half a draft. But the other stuff, yeah, like I kind of know what kind of music they listen to, how they dress, whether they're quiet people or loud, let's say at a party. Are they mixers? Do they hang back? Things like that, I do know.
Do you ever see people in the street now and you're like, oh, I think that's George? Like,
it's funny you should mention that. I have not had that happen with anyone except for George. I was online at the pharmacy late one night. I was picking something up and this man walked in. I've told this story before, but he was wearing like a knee-length leather blazer, if you can picture that, with like a ribbed white tank top underneath, and he had like a belly, and he was short, and he kept calling the woman behind the counter honey. He's like, listen, honey, I've been here 15 minutes. And I'm like, oh boy, this is George. But I kept, he would be offensive to some people, like sweetheart, honey, all this, babe. But he was really, I paid such close attention. He was really kind to them. And, the way some women would be offended by that, now, but he wasn't. He was kind of encouraging them and trying to say that he understands things are busy. I don't know. I got a very weird feeling that it was George, but that has not happened with anybody else.
Oh, that's funny.
There's a question here about any scenes that you had to cut out that you particularly feel attached to or you might regret.
I had to cut a lot. I wrote a lot of drafts of this book, and I think because it covers such a long period, there were things that I included. I just went for it, especially in the first draft. Like if it crossed my mind I went for it. Like some of Lena's family, I went down paths with them, like Lena's brother Carol, how he got out of going to Vietnam. Later on, I had like a 9/11 scene from the cleanup, because both Frances and Peter would have been maybe involved in that in some way. But I don't really regret, I mean, anything I cut, if I don't miss it, it doesn't really do anything for me on its own. It has to hang together with the book. And then once I cut, I don't really think about it. I don't save anything I ever cut. I meet writers sometimes who kind of save their darlings into a folder and hopefully use them at another time. I just really believe that never works, at least for me. I'd feel like I'm like shoehorning them into a spot where they don't really live. But yeah, I mean, at one point, this book, there were probably 700 or 800 pages, and it ended up being 400 pages, and some of those 400 are different than the, and so on. So it's just the trouble with a bigger structure and a long period of time.
Mm-hmm. And so you say you kind of focus more on character. Is that how you drive the plot then? You never have a kind of format of a plot in your head, you kind of let the characters build it. How does that
I started the first draft. I try not to worry too much about what's not working. I want to get it all out and get the character sort of shaped. But then I realized, it has to be propulsive to at least a degree.
Yeah.
So I started cutting whatever didn't have a job exclusive to itself. I do remember there was this one nice scene where Peter and Kate were picking out a Christmas tree. I think it was the first year they bought their house. They moved from an apartment. Kate finds out she's pregnant. She has an ultrasound she puts on the fridge. There were so many things like that. But then I realized that almost every couple, if you're happy, if you go pick out a Christmas tree, it looks almost the same as everyone else's.
Mm-hmm.
And I tried to make it different and things happen, but it didn't really do any work except to say they're happy. The ultrasound moment, it feels special to all of us. It's sort of like telling someone your dream. You think it's interesting. You had the most fascinating dream. No one cares about your dream except for you. It's kind of the same a little bit with the ultrasounds. Your friends are like, oh my gosh, like, what is that? Like,
literally all ultrasounds look the same.
They absolutely do, and nobody. So, I mean, I had a lot of things like that. And I tried to make it so that what was left, if I juxtaposed them, the leap that the reader made would be a little bit of work, but would be sort of a blank space that would be like sort of a connective energy or be connective tissue. I already knew the book was going to be long. And so I didn't want anything there that was just gratuitous.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So there were some assumptions I had to make, and then I had to have faith that the reader was going to do some work on her own.
Yeah.
So Ask Again Yes is not an obvious title at first. Like, I know that there's been a lot of questions and discussion about what it means. And I think like when we revisited the book now for this discussion, it kind of hit me, like Kate and Peter and the proposals and stuff. How did you come up with this title?
So the title is from Joyce. It's from the Molly Bloom soliloquy in Ulysses. But I knew that, a lot of people haven't read Ulysses. I think that's fine. There were just certain things that I went through that I went to when I was having trouble writing. Like if I was having a crap week and nothing was coming out right, I wouldn't really force it. I would have a day or two where I would just read. And there were some things, I like to read new fiction. If I feel like it's really good, it kind of motivates me to write at that level. But sometimes I reread things that I've read a lot. And that section of Ulysses is one of the things that I went to. And I don't know, it just ended up being sort of a touchstone for me. I think that their relationship, Molly and Leopold's, up until Molly's point, sorry if I'm boring the people who haven't read Ulysses, but it's a really cynical book about a relationship that is not in a good place. I mean, they're petty and nasty and cheating on each other. But then something happens at the very end, it switches to Molly's point of view. And you realize that their life together is more than that one day. Mm-hmm. It's a whole thing. It spans many decades. And when she remembers their beginning, she sort of remembers, the tenderness that was there. And it's a reminder to the reader, I think, that you don't know everything about them, despite the nitty gritty that you've gotten about this day. I don't know, there's something, suddenly a cynical novel ends up feeling redemptive and optimistic. And I think I just, when I was really struggling with this book, which was by far my most difficult book to write, I don't know, it felt like I should nod to how much that book helped me. It has, one has nothing, you'd read Ulysses and be like, I see none of this influence here, but something in that turn, it was like steering a ocean liner, it went from being cynical to optimistic in just a matter of a paragraph, was what I really admired.
And as you say, it's not your first book. It's actually your third, I believe.
Yeah, third.
What do you feel you learned from the others? Do you feel like you learned a lot from writing those that impacted the way you approach this and the writing and the direction you took?
I think honestly, the only thing I learned is that I can do it. I think
you do it pretty well.
I mean, my mother always says when it comes to like children, that one never really teaches you how to be a parent to the next one, because they're all so different. And I think it's true for novels too. I mean, if you don't want to write the same novel,
Yes, yeah.
They cover different periods, they're different characters, hopefully you want to do a different thing as a writer. You don't want to, I didn't want to write another book from multiple points of view. All of my books have, they've had different structures and they cover different lengths of time. But for me, so I struggled with the first person with this book for a while, and then I switched it. And I just feel like I can access something much closer to the truth with a multiple point of view. But all of that had to happen. I still made all of those same mistakes with each book, but I just choose to believe with every draft, I'm like getting a little closer.
Yeah.
What it's going to be. But then you fool yourself all over again. Like I'm working on a book now and I'm like, oh, this time I'm going to get it right on the first try. I mean, it's never happened. So why did, you keep fooling yourself over and over.
Yeah. And I mean, last summer, you couldn't really scroll through Instagram without seeing the post, like everyone posting about this book, like everyone. It's kind of like flooding. Were you surprised by this overwhelming response from the bookish community?
Totally. Yeah. I mean, I did not know what this book, above all my others, I wrote sort of for me, and I hoped that people would like it and identify with it and buy it, but not, I mean, my other two books did fine, it was respectable, but not like this. And people, I'm hearing, I was afraid maybe it was too Irish, too working class, too New York, for other people to understand what these people were like. But that's been the single most moving thing, I think, about this, that I'm hearing from people all over. Like I got an Israeli publisher recently, and my agent forwarded a note, and it was like about how similar this person's life was. Like, this could have been my mother, or and I guess I realized everyone has difficult relationships with, obviously, with their mother or father or sibling, or and so it's more universal than I thought.
Yeah.
Do you feel any kind of pressure about the next book you're writing?
Yeah, lots, Rosie. Thanks for asking.
So, are you writing a new book?
I am, yeah.
How far along are you?
I mean, I don't know. It's hard to say. I have a lot of pages. I see people on Twitter all the time, like celebrating the 60,000 word mark. Or I was just saying this to my editor the other day. I guess I just do it differently than a lot of people. Like I could get to the 60,000 word mark like 4 times, so I don't really celebrate word counts because I don't know what they mean. Ultimately, I have lots of pages. I don't, it's early, I don't know if it's interesting to anyone. I just sent to my best reader, another writer. And so we'll see, I don't know. It's a long process. When I look back at like the first set of pages I sent out for Ask Again, Yes, they were really rough and the book didn't end up looking like that. So I don't know.
Sounds like you're very like self-critical and you're like tough on yourself.
That's what my mother would say.
Yeah.
I don't know. Yeah, I guess so. I don't know.
So,
I'm trying my best.
What's your favorite thing then about writing fiction?
Oh God, I don't know. Writing a great paragraph, I think in those early mornings when you set out to capture a certain feeling, you know, maybe like a really nuanced feeling that's contradicts itself and it's complicated, like we all feel. I tell my students there's a difference between what we say and what we think and how we feel. You know, there's 3 levels, and a lot of times what we feel we hide even from ourselves. And I think when I'm able to capture something that I set out for, I mean, that feels really good. Even if it doesn't quite fit in with what I'm doing, even if I don't know what I'm going to do with it, or if it brings the book in a different direction, I think, like you were asking me before, I think that's the thing I've learned, is to like follow the energy that I know works. And I think I write very much with my gut. You know, if I feel bored, I assume the reader will be bored. If I feel energy, you know, you get, you know, that moment when you're reading someone else's, I'm reading a book, you know, and your heart beats faster. Like, I think the writer probably feels that too when they're writing. And so for me, it's very much like a gut driven thing.
Yeah. So Regina has asked, is it going to be made into a movie? We've heard that it's going to be a mini series. Do you have any details?
I do. It's the idea is a limited series, and it's very early stages. That's all I can really say. But some of the key players are on board. I mean, the whole world has stopped right now. I'm a little nervous about that. Production has stopped on most television shows, things like that. So, but that's the plan.
Do you have a
Be back?
Sorry, Rosie, you went silent.
Sorry, do you have a dream cast in mind?
You know, I don't. Someone else asked me that, and then they named a bunch of actors and actresses, and I didn't even know who they were. I mean, I'm totally hopeless at this. There is one person I sort of picture as George.
Oh, who?
The guy from the store that calling him.
The guy from the store. You know that Dominic I don't know how to say his last name, Lombard. He was in Ray Donovan. He was the friend. He was in oh
my gosh, now we're showing that we know nobody.
I know. I'm like my mother. I'm like, the show, it was on the television. Dominic, it's like Lombard disease. Long Italian last name. Anyway,
Luana, who's listening, who can decipher this, please type it.
Google him right now. I follow him on social media because I want to just keep making sure he looks like George.
Don't change.
I want to be clear that absolutely no official conversations have happened ever about this person or anything. It's just whenever I see him on TV, I'm like, he could be George.
Oh, Lombardozzi.
Yeah, doesn't he look like him?
Yeah, that is exactly how I pictured George.
There's my publicist weighing in. Yep, she's right.
That is exactly George. So yeah. In my head, my picture for Anne is Cate Blanchett.
Oh, interesting. Well, that would be wonderful. Yes.
Kate.
I would be willing to accept Cate Blanchett onto this project. Sure.
Yeah. That's Anne in my head.
Yeah, there's a couple of Annes I think that could work. But
oh my gosh, George is like, I'm so glad I envisaged him exactly this way. I mean, that clearly means you did a very good job, but that is who he is.
The Peter and Kate generation is harder because some readers, there are some Instagrammers who do this. They match people to actors and actresses, but sometimes I picture them when they're 20 and sometimes I picture them when they're 40. Sometimes I picture them when they're 12. So I don't know how that would work with the magic of television, like how old. I don't want to do that weird aging thing that movie that just came. What was that movie that just came out? It was like 9 hours long. It was all men.
Oh gosh, The Irishman.
Yeah, I don't want to do that weird thing that they did with that movie where
everyone was CGI.
Old bodies, but we'll see.
Yeah, that Kate and Peter are blurrier to me. I couldn't.
Sorry to everyone who loved The Irishman.
And
I'm Irish and I did not love
I do have to say though, what I think is great is that it's not being made into a movie, because I think book to TV adaptations are far superior to
totally, I agree.
Movies. I just think it, like, I don't know if anyone just watched Normal People, but I haven't read the book, but everyone says it's just as good. And I think cramming, especially with character-driven books, cramming all of that into a movie really destroys it. So I'm glad.
So you really loved the
I love the adaptation. Yeah.
Oh wow, I loved the book. I've been afraid to watch the adaptation.
Yeah, you should watch it.
Okay.
Yeah. But yeah, I think a miniseries will be awesome. It will give the characters breathing space to actually
You have 6 hours or whatever instead of 2. So that's great.
So one more, question on the success of this book. How do you feel it changed you?
Gosh, that's a good. No one's ever asked me that. I don't know. I think it gave me some confidence when I needed it. Writing novels is not an easy thing to do in general, but it's also hard on a family. I couldn't, it's a job, I couldn't do this forever without it being, successful in some small way. It's a lot to ask my kids, my partner. And so I don't know how many more I would have had in me, I teach and I was taking on a lot of editing, and I would have had to do more other types of work, I think. And then the novels would get farther and farther apart. I don't imagine I would ever stop writing. I've been writing since I was 6 before I understood what supporting yourself meant. But I think this gave me confidence. I got my agent didn't like this book at first. A lot of my early readers, they just didn't get that it was about forgiveness, I think, especially when you only have half a book or a quarter of a book. And so I think it taught me to trust my instincts.
Mm-hmm.
Some people really wanted me to write that other historical novel, and maybe I'll write it one day, but this is the book I had to write. And so I did, and I can be a little bit stubborn, but I just decided to do the thing that I felt like I was burning to do at that moment. And that ended up being the right thing.
And so maybe we've touched on this, but how long did it actually take from beginning to end? I know you said you stopped, and would love to hear how you kind of did the research with characters in the police force. That's kind of 2 questions, but how long it takes to kind of do all of that research before writing.
The book took about 4 years of, I did take 1 summer off just because I gave up. I thought I quit the book completely.
Mm-hmm.
I just couldn't figure out how all these different strands were going to come together. The research I sort of do as I go, because I don't know, I want to wear the research pretty lightly. I do sort of foundational research before I begin with a character, but then, I don't get deep into it because there might be stuff I don't need, and you end up reading 30 books and wasting, 6 months of writing time for stuff that might not be that helpful. I was lucky enough to have access to a lot of, particularly detectives, both in the 1970s era and the present day. And so I ended up just taking them to breakfast sometimes. And, we'd have a long chat. I read a lot of memoirs. But the mental illness part of the book, like Anne's arc, was the one I was most nervous about. And for that, I read a lot of memoirs, and I was lucky enough to know a couple of different, to know a psychologist and a psychiatrist who were kind of available to me to answer questions. And that was a question of confidence for me. Part of, I think, writing good fiction is having enough authority in the language for the reader to just believe the things you're saying. And so I think for the first draft, I was nervous about Anne. I wasn't sure. And then the reader can feel that. I have friends who think like, oh, I don't know why I didn't like it, but something with her, but they're right. If you feel a way, then you are the expert in your own reading experience. And if the writer has enough authority, I think, in the voice, then you don't have those questions, So that was hard.
Has there been any criticism you've received that's particular, even on any of the topics? Has anyone said you didn't portray anything in the way they think is believable, or anything tough that you've come up against?
A couple of the sections that I was most worried about, nobody has said a word about. And then there were other things like, I try not to read all the things on social media, but sometimes people tag me on things. I'm like, oh, thank you for the tag, Marge from Milwaukee or whatever. Sometimes I think that people might not understand that the language I used surrounding, mood disorders and mental illness in the 70s and 80s. I can't use the language that we use now. I had to write them as they were. And so I got some notes from people who were upset that it seemed like I painted Anne as sort of one-dimensional at first, but in the sections that sometimes people referred to, I was seeing Anne from, say, Lena's point of view or from Frances's point of view. And that's the way people talked about, if you had a quote unquote crazy neighbor in 1986, you weren't using the language that we use now, in 2020. They would use the language they had then. And so did I. So I wasn't expecting that to not be totally clear. I wouldn't change anything because then it would be totally inauthentic. And I don't want a reader to ever feel like they're being taught a lesson. It has to, I think that if you want to implicate the reader in the story, then that reader has to follow that same arc. If you thought Anne was difficult in the beginning and then you felt bad about that at the end, then you had the experience that I hoped you'd have. You know what I mean?
And you mentioned, sorry, go ahead.
Even I thought that Anne was sort of a destructive character in the beginning, and I didn't have as much sympathy for her when I set out on my first draft. By the end, I considered her the strongest character in the book, in the sense that she could handle more and she went through more because I got to know her better.
You mentioned that you were expecting some kind of negative feedback about certain parts of the book, but this didn't come.
I don't want to suggest any criticism from anyone. Well, there's a reconciliation. I mean, Frances, and this is really a plot spoiler, so cover your ears. But there are two people who were very much at odds. One did something to the other that was not forgivable by a lot of people's standards, and they end up in the same room together, and it ends up not being that big a deal. And I really worried that no one would believe that, and I've heard nothing. From a lot of people, I've heard that's their favorite scene. So I'm glad that worked.
Yeah, it's funny that you say that because it's all part of that like story arc that I love at the end, where like bringing Anne back and just like it is what it is. She's their grandma. She's Peter's mom. Like she needs to be in their life. We need her right now, despite everything.
I thought you were gonna say, Rosie, like now that you mentioned that, I thought that's a garbage scene. So I'm gonna bring it up.
That's the highlight of the entire book for me, is that reconciliation, that forgiveness at the end. I think for me, like when I think of the book, that's the first thing that comes, like Anne, Kate bringing Anne back into the house and using her to help Peter and with the kids, and then the meeting between Frank and Anne was like, ooh.
Yeah. But don't you think this happens all the time, except you're not getting the whole novel? Like I've been to weddings where someone is like, so he used to be married to his first wife. That's their kid. And everyone's like, what's up? I'll meet you at the bar, and nobody, and I think that's the only way to be if you want to be happy in this life. I really do.
And it kind of like I didn't think of all of that at the time, but now that I'm correctly thinking of all of this, it's kind of like you don't always love your husband's family or your wife's family or your other spouse's family, but sometimes you just accept them for the sake of the family, for the sake of your kids. Like there are realities that kind of overshadow some details where you're like, she's the person that has to be here right now. I'll deal with all the consequences, all the history. But that's reality, and that's, I think, what I loved about it.
I think also, grief and love and all of these things are really, really complicated. Like even we have a long estrangement in our family, and I think like sometimes when, say, two people have been estranged and one passes away, the other person like doesn't know how to feel about that. Am I allowed to grieve? Have I allowed? But if it's a parent situation, that's still the person who made you. You're still allowed to have any sort of feeling you want about that. And I think when I thought about getting two people in the room together in this and how that might make everyone else feel, everyone's allowed to feel what they feel. Life is going to go on. But I think like saying any way is right or wrong is a mistake that happens a lot of times in novels that I've read. I think there should be no judgment. The things that happen just happen. And if people identify with those things, then great.
So speaking of no judgment, we have a question from Regina around the character of Brian.
Okay.
You struggle with him. He seemed beyond flawed, the way he treated Anne and especially his son.
You know, I think I am Brian's only defender in this world. People really hate that guy. I totally get it. He did something that was, you know, maybe unforgivable, speaking of forgiveness. But I think of him as a kid who got in way over his head at a time and a culture where, like, you didn't get divorced. You know, what he did was more dramatic, but he, I think if in a different life, if he had married someone else, he would be like the guy. You know, he'd be organizing the block parties, he'd have a barbecue, he'd have the boom box out, putting hot dogs on the grill. He was like a happy guy. He wanted no waves. He basically, you know, he drank too much. But he got served something that was way out of his league. I think back on that scene in the beginning, the prologue of the book, or I point to it, where he tells Frances that he just got married. You know, like this girlfriend he had in academy, they ended up getting married. There was a baby coming. And he was happy then. He was happy to show her picture. He thought she was beautiful. He was okay with the baby. You know, they were going to make their best, you know, and do their best. And I think things kept happening that he was just unprepared for. And it's not that I forgive him. I also think, and this is a theme that is throughout the book, that he'd never left and thought, I'm never coming back. I just don't think people do that. I think we lie to ourselves all the time, and this was part of the point. I think he left and he thought, I'm going to get settled where I am, then I'll send for Peter. Then he thought, and you see people doing this, you know, in our lives, even on like reality shows. He said to himself, oh, well, you know, he's doing so well up there at that school, which is so competitive. I'll leave him there until he gets a degree. Then I'll call for him, or then I'll call for him after, then I'll call for him whenever. And next thing, 20 years have gone by. You know, it's like people who want to cut down on whatever bad thing they're doing. I'll start tomorrow, or I'll be better in the new year, or I'll be better on Monday. You know, it's just a way of keeping yourself, I think, of keeping your own head above water. I don't think he ever understood that he left his child forever. I really don't. But I do understand people hate him. I don't, but I get it.
Have you ever written a character that you really hated?
No, I don't think I'd write them. You know, I think it sort of on this other side of the same coin, I don't think I'd ever write a character who was not flawed, you know, who was not. I think that's honestly why Lena doesn't get as much time on the page as the other characters, is because I really see her as being like totally virtuous, you know, like she has her moments, but she's a good mother. She's a good spouse. She forgives. She's warm. I give her sort of the most important sentence of the book at the end. But, you know, I think reading too much of a good character, wholly good or wholly bad, is just boring, for me anyway.
Oh yeah, definitely. I agree.
What's the most important sentence?
When she says she thinks we've been luckier than most people. At the end.
Nice.
I really blew it for anybody who has not read this book. Now you know the whole thing. This is the cliff notes.
So, you know, in general, like if you were to look up to someone or someone who inspires you, who inspires you, author or otherwise?
I mean, there are a lot of female author. It's amazing how often I got this question and how I am never prepared for it. It's as if I've never read a book. I'm like, I'm sorry, author. I think there are a lot of female authors who are maybe a little bit older than I am, who just keep producing good work and remaining totally themselves, who I really admire a lot. And sort of, you know, when I feel a little lost, I go to one of their books, or I go and read an interview with them and sort of fangirl about them. And I think they would be my dream clique if I had one. I don't know if that's what you want me to name names.
No, up to you. Well, we so Hollie and I host a podcast in non-COVID days, and one of the questions we always ask is, if you were to have dinner with 4 of your authors, dead or alive, who would you choose? So, well, we weren't going to ask you that question, but now I feel like I want to ask that question.
Wait, 4 authors. I should have read. I know you. 4 authors, dead or alive.
Well, I wasn't planning on asking it, but now that you kind of were like, that will be my click. I'm like, should we ask that question?
I don't know. That's a hard one. I would want like both Bronte sisters.
Yeah.
And maybe the brother. That 4, that's really tough. I would need to think about that for a while.
I would have thought you would say James Joyce as the first one.
Well, and the mistress, and you could have your little wedding dinner party.
I would want to see James and Nora Barnacle together because their relationship is fascinating to me. I read a book of letters between them. Mostly it's James writing to Nora. She wasn't much of a writer or a reader. They are filthy. They're great to read. Everyone should read them. But I'd like to see these two in a room together. I think there must be no greater like mismatch in history. I'd like to have dinner with Shakespeare. If
What said Shakespeare before?
Find out like what he really wrote. Well, you know what? I just read Hamnet by Maggie O'Farrell. It's coming out in July. And I've always been interested in Shakespeare. I took a lot of Shakespeare classes in college, but now it's been really that pot has been stirred again because she wrote a novel about Shakespeare's son, Hamnet, whose nickname, or I guess Hamnet is a nickname for Hamlet.
Yeah.
And Shakespeare, and it's really about their lives at that time, the real Shakespeare, his real wife and their family. It's absolutely one of the best novels I've ever read. So I'd like to have Shakespeare maybe and his wife at the table. I don't know, it has to be a bigger table than 4.
Well, I'm sure the restaurants are all empty these days, so we'll find it.
Yeah, you should keep it small.
True.
So on that topic, what are your favorite top 3 books to recommend to others to read?
Present day, I like to keep recommendations to the last maybe 10 years. I loved Louise Erdrich's The Roundhouse. I think it's one of the best books I've ever read. I just admired it as a writer and a reader, and I like all of her work, so picking one that I think is the best really means something. I'm gonna look at my shelves. 3, did you say?
3, yeah. Okay, The Roundhouse.
Oh God, 3. Oh boy. White Teeth by Zadie Smith. It's not on my shelf right now, it's upstairs. Was one of those books that I read when I was like maybe just out of college that really, I don't know, changed a lot for me. How she wrote and that she was so young, and it was such a big book. I think it's it holds up really well over time. And then a third, just one more. I don't know. I mean, Jean-Paul Lahiri's Interpreter of Maladies short story collection was also, I'm basically only picking books that meant something to my writing life.
Yeah.
She has said that William Trevor was a very strong influence on her, and his work is also a strong influence on me. I could see his influence in her, but she still managed to be totally her own writer and person. And I think each story in that collection is exquisite. So I don't know. I'm going to end this call eventually and immediately think of like 12 other books that I should have said instead, but those are solid choices, I think.
There's a question from earlier on from Annie Klein. Have you ever read Alice McDermott or Matthew Thomas?
Yes. I've Matthew Thomas, his book was one of my favorites of whatever year it came out. We Are Not Ourselves. Alice McDermott, I've read almost all of her books, not all of them. I think it's hard to be an Irish American in the world who is a reader without reading Alice McDermott. But sure, I remember reading and arguing about Charming Billy in my household for sure.
Oh, that's funny.
But Billy was more of a fall down drunk. And I did think of that character while I was writing Ask Again Yes sometimes. I felt like the functional alcoholic was a little bit underrepresented in fiction. And McDermott's Irish America is of a different generation than mine. You know, Ireland has changed so much. My parents are Irish born. And so I have thought about the Irish American, you know, relationship my whole life. And her characters are ones I see as my parents' generation, you know, more under the thumb of the church and their local priest and their rosary beads. You know, now we just don't care about that stuff. We're more of the like Sally Rooney set.
Awesome. Well, I want to give everyone who's on here as well an opportunity to ask any other questions. So if you do have any more questions, just drop them in the chat right here so that we can also discuss them. But this was awesome, Mary Beth. Thank you so much for giving us the time to chat through this book. I know we read it a while ago, but it's still like stuck with us. It's definitely one of the best books that we've read in the past year, especially for our Off the Rails book club. So
Thanks,
congratulations, I guess. I know you probably are a little past it now, but and as well with the release of your new.
Never past that. What are you guys doing now about books on the subway? Is the subway?
There's no books on the subway currently.
Not on the subway?
There's books on the bed, books on the windowsill.
Yeah.
On the coffee table.
One day it'll be back. That was one of the most, speaking of Instagram, one of the most exciting pictures when somebody was like holding it up. I think it was the 1 train or the 6. Both were my old trains. One at Barnard and the 6. I used to live on the east side. So I was like, there it is on the subway. It's great.
Well, we got in just in time before.
We complain about the subway too much, and now we can't wait to get back on it.
No, I regret all my old complaints.
Suggested Domhnall Gleeson, and I've just Googled him, and I think he'd make a great, I don't know if you were suggesting for Peter, but he'd be great Peter in the movie.
Oh, and he's in Run right now, right? His father, Brendan Gleeson, is one of my favorite actors.
And hey, his name's Gleeson already, so there we go.
There you go. That's true.
Yeah.
One message.
No, I think we've
got recommendations
from everyone. So thank you so much again, and hope everyone who tuned in enjoyed the discussion like we did.
Thank you for having me. This was really fun.
And everyone, paperbacks out now. They're nice and handy to keep on those nice long walks we're all having. So go head out to Strand or strand.com or Strand's website to get your own copy as well.
Yay.
Bye.
All right. Thank you guys.
Thank you.
Bye.